Good day. Today we start our sixth lesson on the history of medicine. Our today's theme is medical biological field of medicine on the modern time. The new time is identified with the period of the establishment and development of capitalistic relations and the limited conditional chronological framework by 1640s until 1918 years. The 1640, the year of the beginning of the English bourgeois revolution, it defines the boundary between the Middle Ages and the New Time. And 1918 is the year of the end of the World War I, and is admitted to the World Historical Science as the divide between modern and contemporary history. The features of development of medicine at that time. The development of scientific knowledge, mechanics, physics, chemistry. Great importance also played the activity of medical materialistic, such as Leroy, Julien Lemaitre, and Pierre Cabanes. The prominent representatives of the French school of mechanics and materialism. The great scientific discoveries of the late 18th, the first half of the 19th centuries, such as the theory of cellular structure of living organism of Schlein and Schwann, and the law of conservative and transformation of energy, and the evolutionary theory of Charles Darwin. So anatomy. Andreas Vesalius, the founder of the science of anatomy. He corrected mistakes of his predecessors. He was widened, generalized, and systemized the anatomic knowledge. After Vesalius became widespread dissection of cadavers for research, teaching students, as well as public demonstration to colleagues. For this purpose, he used special anatomic theaters. In the 17th century, in the walls of the University of Leiden, formed the largest anatomical school. The pupil of the Leiden school was a Dutch anatomist and surgeon from Amsterdam, Nicolaas Teupel. He conducted research on the comparative anatomy. For the first time, he studied the structure of the anthropoid ape in comparison to the human body. This is his statement: to shine for others is to burn myself. Frederick Rachin. He mastered the techniques of preparation of anatomical species and the method of injection blood vessels by colored and solidified liquids. He invented an original way of building corpse, personally assembled a unique collection of museum exhibits, created the first anatomical museum. Development of anatomy in Russia. In Russia, the start of anatomical dissection is associated with the rule of the Peter I. In Amsterdam, Peter I attended lectures and anatomical museum operated and anatomical dissections. In 1699, Peter I founded in Moscow the courses of anatomy lectures for the boyars with the demonstration on cadavers. In 1717, Peter I bought Reich's anatomical collection, about 2,000 exhibits, and it marked the beginning of the first Russian museum funds. And the museum was named Curiosities. By decree of the king, this collection began to grow and replenish with the works of Russian science. In 1658, the first translation of theatized on Ottoman onto Slavic language. The monk Epiphany Slavinsky translated the book Vesalius Epitome and called it Vrachevskaya Anatomy, from Russian word Vrach, doctor. Early of the 18th century, especially for Peter I, was translated into Russian the famous anatomical atlas by Gottfried Bildow, Anatomy of the Human Body, on the 105 tables. Martin Ivanovich Schein. In 1744, he mounted the first national atlas of anatomy in Latin, in which he composed most of the illustrations. He, for the first time, translates into Russian Compendium Atomeral by Lawrence Heister. The book became the first guide to the anatomy in Russian. He laid the foundations of Russian scientific medical terminology, which did not exist before him. The names of doctors of that period: Konstantin Shetin, first professor of the anatomy, began teaching medicine in Russian. Alexei Protasevich, the first Russian anatomist, academician, he was the student of Mikhail Lomonosov. Alexander Zagorsky, academician, created the first Russian anatomical school at the St. Petersburg. He devoted the Russian anatomical terminology, created the first domestic original guidance for anatomy, reducing anatomy in Russia. Boyalsky, in 1828, published anatomic structure tables. The tables combined data of topographic anatomy and operative surgery, were the first in the Russian domestic atlas of operative surgery. Boyalsky was a master of anatomy and a brilliant surgeon. He created a new surgical instruments, developed a method of embalming the corpse, offered new methods of making thin anatomical preparations. Among the first Russian surgeons, Boyalsky applied anesthesia, starch bandage, and antiseptic agents. He was developed a number of new surgical products on the upper jaw, on blood vessels, and etc. Monographers showed general anatomy of the human body, anatomical notes for students of painting and sculpture at the Imperial Academy of Arts. Nikolai Ivanovich Pirogov, a great anatomist and surgeon, founder of topographical anatomy and innovator method ice anatomy of frozen corpse. At the end of the 19th century, formed the Russian major anatomical research centers: Moscow University, School of Zenov, the study of the anatomy of the central nervous system; Kiev University, School of Beds, and the doctrine of the architectonic of the cerebral cortex; Petersburg, the founder, the founder of the theoretical anatomy and domestic science about the physical education. He argued that the form is constantly changing under the influence of the functions and conditions of the nutrition. Perfective form of a healthy organism is directly depending on the active influence of exercises which were developed scientifically. Histology. The histology is a doctrine about tissues, macroscopic structure, and organs distinguish two periods: until microscope and microscopic. The histology is closely linked with the development of microscope. It is the science that study the structure, the development, and functioning of the living organism tissues. There are the first period, until microscopic, is characterized that the first presentation of the tissue are formed on the basis of anatomical studies corpse. The first scientific generalization made without a microscope, born and created in microscopic techniques, use of magnificently magnifying glass and the creation of the first microscope, accumulated first fragmentary information about the microscopic structure of individual cells. Galileo Galilei designed optical instrument which had a nine-fold increase. The demonstration of his invention in Venice has made great impression. Its optical system Galileo applied to study the structure of various objects and observing planets. Robert Hooke used the term microscope in the natural science. He first discovered and described plant cells at the Cartwell Cock using the microscope with a magnification of 30 times. Marcello Malpighi discovered capillaries, described blood cells, renal corpus and epidermic bears has his name. Antony van Leeuwenhoek. He polished optical glass and reached a high perfection in the manufactures of short focus lens, which made magnification up to 270 times. He first saw and stretched red blood cells, sperm bacteria, certain plants and animal cells. Marie Francisco Javier Bichart made the first attempt to systemize the tissues of the body without the use of a microscope, noted 21 tissue system and described them in detail in his work, Treasures on the Membranes and Shells. General anatomy in the annex to physiology and medicine. Together with cartilages, bones, and other tissues of the system, he divided the hair, the circulation blood system. Microscopic period. The systematic microscope examination of tissues. Cell theory of the structure of organism is one of the largest natural science generalization of the 19th century. Cell theory was formulated in the writings of German science botanist Matthias Schleiden and zoologist Theodor Schwann. Schleiden, in his article Materials for the Biogenesis, showed that each plant cell has a nucleus and defined its role in development and cell division. In 1839, Schwann published an article, Microscope Examination of Conformity in the Structure and Growth of Animals and Plants, in which he determined the cell as a universal structural unit of flora and fauna, showed that plant and animal cells are homologous in structure, similar in function, and gave the main characteristic of their formation, growth, development, and differentiation. Jan Evangelista is a Czech science, one of the cellular structure founder. The founder of the Prague School of Histology, an honorary member of many foreign academies. For the first time, saw the nerve cells in the gray matter of the brain. He describes the elements of glia, identified large cells in the gray matter of the cerebral cortex. This cell bears his name. He discovered a fiber conduction system of the heart, Purkinje fibers. Garvey, the English physician and physiologist and embryologist, with his name is associated with the birth of the embryology science. He researched on the origin of animals, and after studying the development of chicken and some mammals, Harvey rejected the idea of spontaneous generation and put forward reasoned arguments against preformation. He summed up the idea of the egg as the source of all animals. René de Graaf, the Deutsch anatomist and physiologist. He contributed to the development of anatomy, physiology, histology, and embryology. For the first time, studied the semiphorous tubulars and identified them as blood vessels that produce the seed. He described the female bubble gonads earlier mistakenly called an egg, hence the name the Avaric. Caspar French Wolf. He provided that the egg does not contain preformed embryo. He signed out 2 sheets of embryonic tissue and showed that the elementary canals is formed from the lower sheet, which does not exist in the early stage of development. He supposed that the central nervous system is formed from the top sheet and that all other organs are formed as a result of gradual structural differentiation of the organism in the process of fetal development. Bayer first saw and described the egg mammals and humans, has researched and described the development of all basic organ systems of vertebral germ layers. He showed that in the process of fetal development, firstly appears the property type, then the class unit, and etc. Species and individual symptoms appear at later stages of embryogenesis. Human embryo develops similarly to all vertebrates. Kovalevsky Alexander Anufrievich. He scientifically proved links between vertebrae and invertebrates. He developed a unified theory of germinal layers for all the animal world. Biology and genetics. From Greek bio, to live, and logos, teaching. The totality of life science. Becoming biology is closely related to the formation of the historical development of the organic world. Elements of this idea was appeared in the works of ancient Greek philosophers. Carl Linnaeus, his System of Nature, the first time offered the basics of classification of 3 kingdoms, plants, animals, and minerals. Each kingdom is divided into detachments, genera, and species. For the first time, the human is located in the class of mammals, detachment of primates. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He argued that between the species of animals are no sharp edges. Species are not constant. They vary, acquiring new properties under the influence of the environment and inherit these attributes. He opposed the concept of performation, arguing that all living bodies originate from one another, but do not develop from the pre-existing embryos. Charles Darwin, the founder of the theory of evolution. He argues that there is in the world of animals and plants descended from earlier common species as a result of evolution. The main factors of evolution he defined as variety, genetics, and natural selection in a struggle for existence. Charles Darwin was awarded an honorary doctorate at Cambridge, Bonn, Breslavsky, and Leiden University, corresponding members of the Petersburg and Berlin Academies of Science. Gregor Mendel. In experiments of hybridization of 2 varieties of pears, he was found that organisms contain genetic factors that are transmitted to offspring when crossed, have a discrete nature and pass from generation to generation. Experiments on plant hybrid. Mendel has outspirited the science of his time. His discovery did not receive adequate assessment and long remained in the shadows. 1911, the creation of the chromosomal theory of heredity by Thomas Morgan and his staff. Since then, the leading theory of genetics has become a materialistic concept of gen. Microbiology. It is the science about microorganisms, their structure and activity, the changes they cause in humans, animals, plants, and inanimate nature. Emerged in the second half of 19th century. The representatives, Leeuwenhoek, the first found living microorganism and described them in his book, Secrets of Nature, open Anthony Leeuwenhoek. Samuelvich is a Russian doctor, first suggested the idea of the specificity of the plague. He claimed that the plague is caused by a special being. He came to the idea of preventing the plague by introducing into the body weakened infective agents. In 1803, Samuelvich injected himself infectious material taken from a person who recovered from the bubonic form of a plague. Edward Jenner. Jenner noticed that peasant woman who milking cows with cowpox had bubbles resembling smallpox pustules on his hands. This peasant woman never became ill with smallpox. In 1796, conducted experiments by the method of vaccination. 8-year boy was vaccinated from pustulous peasant hands infected with cowpox. 1.5 months later, Jenner did boy an injection in which was contents of a patient with pustulous smallpox. The boy was not ill. Repeated attempts to infect the boy with smallpox 5 months later did not give any result. The boy have had immune to the disease. Repeating the experiment 23 times, in 1798, Jenner published an article entitled Study of Causes and Effects Cowpox. Vaccination has been put into the British Army and the Navy, and in 1803 was organized by the Royal Society Genevsko, which was headed by Jean. Antiseptic and aseptic. Ignaz Schleming suggested the method of protection. He was the founder of antiseptic. Working on in abstract clinics, has paid attention to the fact that in the same branch of where trained students, the death rate from childbirth fever reached 30%. And in another, where students were excluded, the mortality rate was low. He showed that the cause of this disease are the dirty hands of students who come to the maternity ward after the section of corpse. So he suggests the method of protection, hand washing, with a solution of chloride of lime, and mortality decreased to 1 to 3%. Joseph Liston. He gave a scientific explanation of surgical infections to develop measures to combat it. Louis Pasteur. He showed that the process of fermentation and petrification associated with microorganisms. His key discoveries are the enzymatic nature of lactic acid, alcohol, and butyric fermentation, the study of disease of wine and beer, refutation of the hypothesis of spontaneous generation, the basics concepts of artificial immunity, creation of a vaccine against anthrax and rabies. Pasteur has organized the world's first rabies station in Paris. He created a special institute for the fight against rabies and other infectious disease. Pasteur was chief of institute. Subsequently, the Pasteur Institute, as it was called at the suggestion of the French Academy of Science, has become the largest center of scientific through the field of microbiology. Ilya Ivanovich Mechnikov organized the first Russian station, Pasteur, anti-rabies, and other infectious disease. He discovered that the mesodermal cells, white blood cells, spleen cells, bone marrows, and etc., to act as the body's defense against pathogens. On the 7th Congress of Russian Naturalists and Physicians in Odessa, he made the first report on the phagocyte theory about protection power of the body. Paul Ehrlich laid the foundation for the doctrine of antibody as factor of humoral immune. Mechnikov and Ehrlich were awarded the Nobel Award for the creation of the doctrine of immunity. Gopleyevsky began teaching microbiology at the University of Moscow, organized production of diphtheria serum in Moscow. Zabolotny founded Russia's first department of microbiology at the St. Petersburg Women's Medical University, made a great contribution to the study of the epidemic of plague. Gamaliel engaged in the prevention of typhus, smallpox, and plague. Robert Koch set the rule, which became known as the trade of Henry Koch, in order to provide ethologic role of microorganism in the event of the contagious disease should to detect the microbe in every cause of the disease and other disease or healthy person, it should not occur. Isolated from the body of the patient in pure culture, cause the same disease in an experimental animal, infected his pure culture of this microbe. The suggested method of growing pure bacterial culture and studied the etiological of anthrax. Discovered Mycobacterium tuberculosis and cholera. General pathology. Pathological anatomy, the science that studies the structural basis of pathological process, separated from the anatomy in the middle of the 18th century. Its development in the new history is divided into two periods, macroscopic and microscopic. The macroscopic period. Bartolomeo Estarza, first time in the second half of the 16th century, introduced in the Roman hospital systematic dissection of the dead, and thus contributed to the formation of pathological anatomy. Giovanni Battista Margani compared the change that he found in the autopsies of infected corpse with the symptoms of the disease which he observed in the patient's life. He laid the foundation of clinical and anatomical principles and created the first scientifically based classification of disease. Microscopic period. Karl von Rokitansky. He created Europe's first department of pathological anatomy. The main cause of illness he considered a violation of the composition of fluids of an organism, dyscrasia. The local pathological process is considered as a manifestation of a general disease. Rudolf Virlovich. He created the theory of a cellular cell, pathologically called cellular pathology, as a doctrine based on physiological and pathological histology. Honorary member of the scientific societies and academics of almost all countries of the world. He first described and studied pathological anatomy of inflammation, leukocytosis, embolism, thrombolism, phlebism, leukemia, renal amyloidosis, fatty degeneration, tubercular nature of lupus, glial cells. He created terminology and classification of basic pathological conditions. He founded the scientific journal Archive of Pathological Anatomy, Physiology, and Clinical Medicine, today published under the title Archives of Virchow. So this is all for this sixth lecture for today. See you on next lecture. Goodbye.